Year 1775. North America is a cold desert. 13 separate colonies that are not a united nation. Its inhabitants are farmers, blacksmiths, and local merchants. They don't have a regular army or heavy weapons factories. They only have virgin land and a growing feeling of total suffocation. Each colony lives by its own laws, there is no common currency, and there is no centralized military leadership either. They are isolated communities that distrust each other, where the only real union is discontent against the same distant crown. On the other side of the Atlantic awaits the great monster, the British Crown. The most efficient, rich, and ruthless military machine on earth. No one challenges the crown and lives to tell the tale, for they have crushed rebellions all over the globe. They have infinite gold, and their ships dominate the trade routes of the entire world. The coming confrontation is not crazy, it is absolute suicide. The strategists in London see this as child's play, because they know that the colonies have no way of sustaining real resistance in the long term. The colonists do not have identical uniforms, nor training on large European battlefields. Their weapons are old hunting rifles, and their leaders have never led a real, large-scale war. Furthermore, the lack of gunpowder is a daily problem, since the reserves are barely enough for a few days of combat. Fear is breathed in every corner of American towns, where men look at their families knowing the fate that awaits them. If they fail, hanging will be the only end for all rebels, because the empire does not forgive betrayal of the crown. However, the indignation is too strong. London's tax laws crush its local economy, and excessive taxation breaks social peace. British soldiers guard the colonial streets with complete arrogance, taking over civilian homes by force of bayonets. Violence is about to break out in the American mud. Discussions in taverns are no longer about trade, freedom is now spoken of in hushed tones, and secret meetings become the daily bread of American ports. The fate of an entire continent hangs in the balance. The 13 weak colonies walk straight into the military abyss, ready to face the most disciplined infantry in human history. No one in the world believes they can withstand the first blow of King George III. Even betting houses in Europe consider the revolution dead before it begins. The history of humanity seems to have been written in advance, a David without a sling, facing a Goliath armed with the most lethal steel of the 18th century. The storm is already here. The bells of the rural churches begin to ring loudly in the cold night, while the horsemen ride along the dark roads to raise the alarm. The enemy advances. The British drums reverberate in the distance, marking a firm and relentless pace. The farmers take up their weapons with trembling hands, because the first block of this long nightmare is about to begin on the battlefields. In the distant city of London, King George III's generals smile with complete tranquility. For the imperial mentality, this situation does not represent a real war, but simply an uncontrolled revolt of ungrateful and disorganized peasants. The arrogance of the British High Command is its first great invisible enemy. For this reason, they design an extremely simple and linear military strategy to capture the main cities of the American coast: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They firmly believe that, by controlling the strategic ports, the rebellion will die from immediate economic asphyxiation. British warships drop thousands of professional soldiers onto American beaches. The troops march in perfect columns, and their red uniforms shine in the pale winter sun. The fixed bayonets intimidate anyone who dares to look at them. The London plan looks perfect on desktop maps, but the reality will be very different. British generals are used to great campaigns in the European countryside, where war has strict rules of honor and fixed positions. You capture the enemy's capital, the king signs the surrender, and the conflict ends immediately. But the British High Command made a psychological mistake that would prove fatal. They judged the geography of the American continent, using only their European eyes. In America, political power and armed resistance are not hidden behind the walls of a royal palace, nor do they depend on a single main city. The true American power lives in the immensity of its untamed forests. It lives in the indomitable will of simple men, who would rather watch their houses burn than kneel again before a foreign monarch. The British Crown won the first urban battles with astonishing ease. They captured the main ports and celebrated the victory in the ballrooms of New York. However, the only thing they inherited was an immense, hostile, and ungovernable territory. Outside the cities, Crown control completely faded into the weeds. British supplies had to travel over dirt roads full of mud and hidden enemies. Each conquered village was immediately transformed into a silent nest of revolutionary spies and nightly sabotage. Military arrogance prevented the Crown's generals from understanding the true nature of the conflict. They were not facing a traditional army seeking to defend an established border. They were facing an armed civilian population defending their own homes and their own land. The British underestimated the economic and human cost of maintaining permanent garrisons on such a vast continent. They thought that the brute force of their redcoats would be enough to impose order, but it was the first great setback of a blind empire. The occupation troops began to suffer the weight of their own gigantism, as orders took weeks to arrive from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. British officers were frustrated at not finding an enemy who would show their face in the open field. The quick victory that was promised to Parliament in London was beginning to fade on the American horizon. The red line stretched too far on a map that they could not master. The miscalculation was made and the price to pay would be extremely high. Lexington and Concord, two small names that changed the course of history forever. The spark of revolution is finally lit on the American soil, and the old order of the colony is broken into 1,000 pieces in a single morning. There is no turning back for the rebels. The first shots of this war are not rhythmic, they are not elegant, nor do they follow traditional military protocol, they are violent. It's the pure sound of mutual panic, armed neighbors shooting at professional soldiers from behind the stone walls of rural roads. The colonists immediately discover the harsh and bloody reality of a real war. Their local militias are not ready for the brutality of hand-to-hand combat. When the British infantry fixes their bayonets and the cavalry charges, fear grips the American ranks. Men run desperately for their lives, and many fall screaming in the open fields, hit by the disciplined fire of the redcoats. London shows no mercy to traitors, and each initial confrontation makes it clear that goodwill is not enough to win freedom. The rebellion needs urgent order, it needs a real military structure, or it will be completely crushed before next winter arrives. The leaders of the Continental Congress understand that the enthusiasm of the first days will soon fade, if there is no organized force to sustain the conflict. The militiamen want to return to their farms to raise the season's crops. No one wants to die in a makeshift trench far from their home. The revolutionary cause seems to be crumbling, due to lack of discipline, money, and adequate weapons. In this scenario of chaos, the myth of the settler soldier begins to collide with the harsh reality of modern war. The rebels' weapons are poor and have no spare parts, many carry old muskets that jam after the third shot. The shortage of gunpowder is so serious that officers require their men not to fire until they can see the color of the enemy's eyes. Every bullet counts, every life lost is a tragedy for a small community that is running out of young men. Despite the initial disasters, something profound has changed in the collective mind of the 13 colonies. The fear of the king's punishment begins to transform into a silent and shared fury. Rural churches become makeshift recruiting centers, as women and children take on the heavy work in the fields, so the men can march to the front. The conflict is no longer a simple dispute over customs taxes, it has become an all-out fight for the very existence of their families and their land. The rebellion spreads like fire in a dry forest. News of the first deaths travels from north to south, igniting the pride of the most remote regions. The British military might believe they are controlling a local revolt in the Massachusetts countryside. They do not realize that they have unleashed a force that they can no longer contain with royal decrees. The beginning of the rebellion is painful, confusing, and full of American casualties, but the seed of resistance is already sown deep in American soil. George Washington assumes supreme command of a veritable army of ghosts. The so-called Continental Army is not a respectable military force, it is simply a disorderly mass of starving men. They wear completely torn civilian clothes, and many walk barefoot on the cold ground. They are armed only with personal hunting rifles or old family muskets, without factories to continuously produce gunpowder. The Army's strategic reserves are so low that they barely cover a few hours of real combat in the open field, a bleak outlook for the new commander. George Washington's tall, firm silhouette stands against a merciless gray sky. The general observes the horizon mounted on his warhorse, with a face that reflects absolute fatigue and deep concern. The wrinkles on his forehead show the weight of an unbearable responsibility. Washington is not a man who smiles easily in front of his subordinates. He knows perfectly well that world history will judge him for his actions. If he fails in his mission, his head will end up on a pike by direct order of the British Crown. The new general understands a fundamental strategic truth that congressional politicians fail to see. Washington knows that he does not need to completely destroy the British Army in a large European-style pitched battle. Attempting a frontal attack against the disciplined Red Lines would be a death sentence for his men. Your true and only military mission is to ensure that the American military survives another day. If the rebel force still exists on the map, the American Revolution remains alive and beating. Washington makes the decision to convert tactical withdrawal into its best combat tool. He would rather be criticized for cowardice than lose his soldiers in a useless confrontation. The American army constantly runs when the situation becomes aggressive, hides among the dense vegetation of the hills, and avoids direct contact with the elite forces of King George III. Cold, calculated patience is gradually becoming the main military doctrine of this new era of American resistance. Soldiers suffer constant casualties from disease and mass desertions along the way. Many men decide to leave the ranks because they miss their families and farmlands, so Washington must use iron discipline to maintain cohesion within the makeshift camps. The punishments are severe for those who try to escape their obligations to the nation, but despite the pain, the general manages to earn the deep respect of the men who decide to stay and fight at his side in any circumstance. The Continental Army becomes a walking symbol of the resistance of an entire people. They don't win big heroic victories on the maps, but they also don't let London completely destroy them. Every escape maneuver by Washington exasperates the British generals settled in the comfortable cities. The war becomes a game of cat and mouse that consumes London's resources. The Ghost Army is still alive and ready to resist the harsh winter ahead. The British soldiers marched prepared for a purely European war, with perfect lines of men and the sound of military drums to mark the pace of the infantry. They looked for open, clear fields to maneuver with ease, but America was nothing like Europe. America was an endless wall of primitive trees and wild, muddy roads. A hostile terrain that the generals of the British Crown did not know how to dominate with their traditional linear combat tactics. Every step outside the cities became a mortal danger for the king's troops. In this dense jungle scenario, the riflemen of the American border appear. They were rustic men raised in the farthest mountains of the 13 colonies, who did not wear dress uniforms, nor did they know how to march to the rhythm of war drums. They used wild animal skins to camouflage themselves perfectly with the forest vegetation. These riflemen did not respect the rules of military chivalry of the time, so the British Crown considered their tactics an unacceptable act of cowardice. However, the American rebels considered them their only real option for survival. The first big broken rule of traditional warfare was to aim directly at enemy officers. In the European military code of the time, officers were respected and were not shot in the first minutes of combat. The American riflemen destroyed that unwritten rule in their first ambush in the dark woods. They knew perfectly well that an army without leaders quickly becomes a mass of frightened and directionless men. With a single accurate shot from the undergrowth, the king's order completely crumbled in seconds. The weapons of these mountain people were the famous frontier rifles. They had a rifled barrel, which allowed astonishing accuracy at distances that British muskets could never reach. A single shooter hidden in the top of a tall tree could stop the advance of an entire column of redcoats. The shot sounded like a whiplash in the middle of the silence of the forest. An officer fell to the ground, mortally wounded, and then, the British soldiers fired blindly into the bushes, wasting their ammunition uselessly. Frustration took hold of the British Army on each march through American territory, since the enemy was invisible and did not show its face for a formal battle. The rebels would fire a couple of shots from the safety of the trees, and then disappear completely into the deep fog, before the enemy bayonets could reach them. There was no glory in these forest battles, only a steady trickle of British casualties, which destroyed the morale of the replacement soldiers arriving from London. The regular and elegant war of the history books had died definitively on American soil. Guerrilla warfare, based on extreme mobility and absolute surprise, had just been born to balance the scales. The weak settlers found their best strength in the forest, and their best strategic ally. The imperial machine was beginning to bleed slowly but steadily, because of an invisible enemy that refused to play by the rules. Geographic distance became the most implacable and silent enemy of the British Crown. Every lead bullet needed for muskets, every food ration for soldiers in the field, and every spare uniform to replace clothing torn by combat, absolutely all military equipment had to cross more than 5,000 kilometers of a violent and treacherous Atlantic Ocean. A logistical nightmare unprecedented in the history of world navigation, where a single delay due to storms meant months of absolute shortages on the battlefront. It took British transport ships between 2 and 3 months to complete the risky journey from the ports of England. Many times, when the supplies finally reached American shores, the food was already completely rotten and the water was not drinkable. The average British soldier at the front spent weeks on end munching on hard biscuits filled with worms in the constant rain. His boots were falling apart in the mud of the American roads, exposing his frozen toes, reducing the glorious life of London to unbearable daily misery. Meanwhile, finances in the city of London began to bleed at an alarming rate. Maintaining a gigantic army on the other side of the planet required a colossal economic investment that emptied public coffers. Transportation costs and salaries for occupation soldiers skyrocketed to unsustainable levels, so the British Parliament was forced to drastically raise taxes within England itself. Social unrest soon broke out in the streets of the imperial capital. The average British citizen began to seriously question the usefulness of such a long, expensive and distant war. The political opposition within Parliament gained strength with each report of casualties that came from America. The strategy of patience designed by George Washington was beginning to demonstrate its true genius on the international stage. The rebels understood perfectly well that they did not need to militarily defeat the Red Lines on the battlefield, they just needed to stretch out the conflict long enough to make the war financially unviable for London. Winning independence through economic exhaustion of the enemy became the absolute priority of the 13 colonies. Every month that the Continental Army managed to stay alive in the forests, it was a silent strategic victory against the pocket of King George III. London was caught in a trap of its own military arrogance, spending millions of pounds trying to control an immense territory that generated no immediate economic benefit, while the bankruptcy of the British Navy loomed behind each useless military campaign. The richest war machine on planet Earth was beginning to lose steam due to its own gigantism and the insurmountable distance. Officers in America sent desperate letters requesting more men and more money so they could put down the rebellion once and for all. However, responses from London were increasingly slow and restrictive due to the lack of available funds. The war of attrition was destroying the foundations of imperial pride slowly, silently and irreversibly in the mud of America. December of the year 1777. The Valley Forge military camp becomes the scene of the darkest and most painful point of the entire American Revolution. The winter of that year enters with extreme force and climatic violence that freezes men's bones. In this piece of frozen land there were no major pitched battles against the British soldiers. The rebels' true and only battle was against the brutal forces of untamed nature. A desperate fight for daily survival against the most absolute hunger and the most heartbreaking cold. 11,000 soldiers of the Continental Army are trapped in a valley covered by a thick blanket of white snow. They do not have adequate clothing to resist the very low temperatures of the winter season. Military jackets are just torn rags that do not cover the chest of the fighters. Footwear is a non-existent luxury within the Washington camp. Hundreds of men are forced to wrap their bare feet in pieces of dirty blankets or old cloth soaked in animal fat to prevent their toes from freezing completely. Traces of fresh blood become a terrible constant on the white snow of the camp roads. It is the blood that flows from the bare feet of the American soldiers who march to carry out their daily surveillance duties. The food shortage is so severe that weekly rations are reduced to a tasteless mixture of hot water with a little burnt flour. Pack horses die by the dozen due to lack of fodder, and their frozen bodies are left abandoned among the rudimentary wooden huts. Infectious diseases soon appear to devour what little remains of the rebel troops' morale. Typhus, dysentery, and the terrible smallpox spread with frightening rapidity to every corner of the improvised dormitories. More than 2,500 men lose their lives in the course of a few months without having fired a single bullet against the enemy. Mass graves are dug at night in the frozen ground before the earth becomes as hard as river rock. Any other traditional army in the European world would have completely disintegrated in such a level of suffering and starvation. The men would have deserted en masse or signed an unconditional surrender to the British Crown forces to save their lives. However, in the midst of the frozen mud and utter squalor of Valley Forge, something deep and inexplicable changed forever within the American soul. The soldiers who managed to survive that white hell were no longer simple farmers with a rifle in their hands. Those emaciated men were transformed into authentic war veterans hardened by the most heartbreaking pain that a human being can endure. The snow and extreme cold of Valley Forge molded the steel of a disciplined and tireless new military force. They learned to march together, to obey orders with fire, and to blindly trust George Washington's leadership. The ghost army that entered the winter as a disorganized militia emerged from the frozen fields ready to resist any blow from the nation. Year 1781. The strategic board of the war reaches its final act on the Yorktown Peninsula, in the state of Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis makes a tactical error in calculation that would prove completely irreversible. He decides to entrench his entire army of 7,000 men at the tip of a spit of land surrounded by water. Your strategic plan depends entirely on one basic premise. He firmly believes that the powerful navy of the British Crown will come to rescue him by sea if the situation turns deadly. It was his military death sentence. Fate plays its most unexpected card against the pride of the generals of the largest crown on planet Earth. For the only time in the entire course of the armed conflict, the warships that appear on the horizon do not carry British colors. It is the ships of the French fleet that managed to establish an absolute and perfect naval blockade over the bay. Escape by sea is completely cancelled for the troops of King George III. The trap, designed by the patience of George Washington, is closed with surgical, ruthless precision. The Continental Army blocks any possible exit through the mainland, through an endless network of trenches dug in the mud. The British, accustomed to besieging other people's cities, now find themselves trapped inside a cage of mud in absolute despair. The Yorktown night lights up with the start of a massive heavy artillery bombardment that shakes the ground of the peninsula. The American and French cannons fire non-stop against the British fortifications that are beginning to crumble piece by piece. The roar of the explosions fills the ears of the soldiers trapped in the King's defense lines. Dirt flies through the air, mixed with the thick white smoke of burning gunpowder, which clouds the combatants' vision. George Washington himself walks through the mud of the advanced trenches to light the fuse of a cannon with his own hands. The psychological strain is unbearable for the redcoats, who see their food and ammunition reserves drop to critical levels, as there is no help on the way. On October 19, 1781, the military pride of England is definitively broken before the eyes of the entire world. 7,000 professional soldiers of the Crown march in absolute silence, with their heads bowed, handing over their weapons to the American rebels. General Cornwallis claims a sudden illness, to avoid the pain and public humiliation of handing over his sword in person to Commander Washington. British drums play a sad melody, as they march through the ranks of men they once despised as simple peasants. The great impossible war, that all analysts in Europe considered lost before it began, has come to its definitive end. The British collapse at Yorktown demonstrates that the brute force of a giant empire cannot overcome organized local resistance. Patience, logistical attrition, and intelligent use of indomitable geography defeated the best troops of the old continent. The redcoats begin a silent retreat toward their surviving ships, leaving behind a land they could never truly conquer. The thick smoke from Yorktown's cannon slowly dissipates over the still waters of the York River. The dawn of a new era begins to illuminate the battlefields that were marked by destruction. The American soldiers observe the horizon with tired faces, covered in soot, but with steady gaze. They know that they have achieved what everyone considered complete military madness. The great British machine gathers its broken flags, and definitively withdraws from the territory it tried to subdue by force of steel. The great powers of human history do not fall solely because of the lack of modern weaponry or professional soldiers on the front lines. Nations collapse when they completely lose the political will to continue financing an endless war on the other side of the ocean. The citizen of the 13 colonies understood from day one the hidden weaknesses of his gigantic colonial rival. He embraced patience as his primary military doctrine, used the wild terrain to his advantage, and turned economic exhaustion into a perfect strategic art. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, puts the final seal of ink and paper on this long nightmare of blood. The 13-week colonies, divided and ill-prepared at the beginning of history, cease to exist forever on official maps. In its place, a new political entity is legally born that will change the destiny of the entire planet. The United States of America emerges from the mud of war, as a sovereign nation free from the shackles of any distant European monarch. No one in the halls of the imperial palaces of Europe managed to gauge the true geopolitical impact of this historic event. They thought that the new American Republic would be a failed experiment that would soon disintegrate due to its own internal differences. They didn't understand that the Continental Army, which survived the frozen hell of Valley Forge, had created a collective mentality of persevering steel. Men from different regions had bled together, with the same blue and starry flag, in the dark trenches of the Revolution. The end of this cinematic documentary does not just celebrate the ceasefire, or the signing of a peace agreement. It portrays the silent, painful, and definitive birth of the next superpower that will dominate the threads of the contemporary world. A nation protected geographically by the vastness of two great oceans, ready to expand westward and claim an entire continent. The farmers, who once trembled before the steady step of the imperial red lines, now walk with their heads held high. The strategic lesson that remains etched in the pages of military history is extremely clear for future generations. A military force apparently inferior in numbers and economic resources can resist and defeat the largest nation on earth. All it takes is a will that refuses to give up, hostile terrain well exploited, and the patience necessary to exhaust the enemy. The American giant has woken up from the mud of the revolution, and the map of the world will never be the same again.